Thomas and Claire Williams were the couple everyone admired. He, a successful accountant with a polished smile, and she, the devoted wife who planned the perfect 40th birthday party. But before the candles were blown out, a single unexpected guest arrived, and by the next morning, Thomas would be dead, his marriage exposed as a web of secrets and betrayal. On a warm Saturday evening, the Williams home was alive with music, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. The occasion was special. Thomas Williams had turned 40, and his wife Claire had spent weeks planning every detail to make sure it was a night he would always remember. Friends from work, neighbors from down the street, and even a few relatives filled the house, their voices blending into a cheerful hum. The dining table was covered in food, the kind of spread that made people talk about a party long after it ended. In the corner, a cake with 4 sparkling candles waited for the moment when everyone would gather to sing. Thomas stood at the center of it all, smiling and shaking hands, a man who seemed to have everything. He had a stable job, a comfortable home, and a wife who adored him, or so it appeared to the outside world. Claire moved gracefully between guests, offering drinks, checking on the food, and making sure everyone felt welcome. Her eyes often landed on Thomas, her expression soft, as though she wanted everyone to see just how proud she was of her husband. There was an air of perfection about the night. The balloons tied to chairs swayed gently with each movement in the room. The music was upbeat but never too loud, and the guests kept remarking on how Claire had thought of everything. Even the neighbors, who sometimes whispered about the couple being too private, couldn't help but admire the flawless celebration. Yet beneath the glitter of streamers and the warmth of toasts, there was an invisible crack forming. Thomas carried himself with confidence, but now and then his eyes darted toward the door, as though he was waiting for someone unexpected. Claire didn't notice, not yet, but she would. The party was in full swing when the doorbell rang, its sharp sound cutting through the music and chatter. At first, no one paid much attention. Guests assumed it was a late arrival, another friend or colleague coming to join the festivities. Claire, always the perfect hostess, hurried to the door with a welcoming smile. But the expression froze on her face when she saw the woman standing there. She was tall, poised, and dressed in a way that drew every eye the moment she stepped inside. In her hand was a neatly wrapped box, tied with a silver ribbon. She introduced herself with a confidence that seemed out of place at such an intimate gathering. The room fell into a hushed curiosity, and people watched as Thomas caught sight of her. For a brief second, he looked as though he had seen a ghost. The color drained from his face, and the easy smile he had been wearing all evening collapsed into a tight, nervous expression. Claire, still holding the door open, noticed the change immediately. The woman walked further into the house, her heels clicking softly against the floor. She spoke politely, but there was an edge to her tone, as though her presence carried a hidden purpose. Guests exchanged glances, sensing tension they didn't understand. Claire tried to mask her confusion by offering a drink, but the stranger declined and instead turned her attention solely to Thomas. It was a subtle gesture, yet impossible to ignore. Though she gave no explanation for how she knew him, the familiarity in her gaze said enough. This wasn't an old friend stopping by. It was someone with a deeper connection, someone who didn't belong in that room, but had every reason to be there. And the longer she stayed, the heavier the silence became. The atmosphere in the room shifted when the woman handed Thomas the gift. Everyone expected something simple, maybe a bottle of wine or a book, the kind of present acquaintances often bring to social gatherings. But the weight of the small box, carefully wrapped and topped with a delicate ribbon, suggested something more personal. Thomas hesitated before unwrapping it, his hands stiff, as if he already knew what was inside. When the lid came off, the room leaned in closer, curiosity turning into unease. Inside was a wristwatch, sleek and expensive, glinting under the soft light. But it wasn't the watch itself that caught attention. It was the engraving on the back. The words were etched in clean, precise letters, "To many more years together." It was a message of intimacy, a promise, a declaration that spoke volumes about the kind of bond Thomas had shared with this woman. Claire's eyes fixed on the inscription, and her chest tightened as if all the air in the room had been sucked away. She tried to control her expression, but her cheeks flushed, betraying the storm building inside her. Guests shifted uncomfortably, some whispering to one another, others pretending to sip their drinks to avoid acknowledging the obvious. What was supposed to be a joyous evening now carried the heavy weight of suspicion. Thomas laughed awkwardly, trying to brush it off as a misunderstanding, but the nervous edge in his voice only made things worse. The woman's smile lingered, sharp and deliberate, as though she had achieved exactly what she intended. Claire, still holding her glass, forced herself to stay composed, but her hands trembled slightly. The gift, so small in size, had pierced through the carefully crafted image of their marriage. The celebration had turned into an exposure, and nothing could reverse it. When the unexpected guest finally left, the house seemed to exhale, but the damage remained. The echo of her presence lingered in every corner, like smoke that refused to clear. Guests tried to recover, but the tension was impossible to ignore. Conversations that once flowed with ease became stilted, punctuated by uneasy laughter. Some people found excuses to leave early, while others stayed out of sheer politeness, their eyes flicking nervously between Thomas and Claire. Claire moved through the room with a smile that looked real from a distance but was fragile up close. She poured drinks, cut slices of cake, and thanked everyone for coming, her voice steady but hollow. Inside, humiliation burned hotter with every passing minute. The betrayal wasn't only private anymore. It had been put on display, stripped bare for friends and family to witness. She wasn't just a wife who had been deceived, she was now a wife who had been humiliated in public. Thomas avoided her gaze, focusing on small talk with anyone who would listen, but the unease in his posture betrayed him. He laughed louder than usual, gestured more than necessary, desperate to appear unbothered. Yet nothing could erase the image of the woman who had walked in so confidently and left behind such devastation. By the time the last guests said their goodbyes, the house was quiet again, but the silence was heavier than any crowd. Streamers hung limply, balloons had started to sag, and the cake remained half-eaten on the table. Claire collected empty glasses, her movements calm, almost methodical, but her thoughts churned violently. The mask she had worn all evening was beginning to crack. Anger seeped through every vein, and beneath it, a resolve was forming. She knew she would not allow this night to end the way Thomas had imagined. The house had finally gone still, stripped of laughter and music. Only the faint hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. Thomas, tired from drinking and trying to smooth over the disaster of the evening, made his way upstairs. He sank into bed without much thought, his body heavy, his mind clouded with exhaustion and denial. To him, sleep was an escape, a way to push aside the humiliation and the tension that hung in the air. But to Claire, the night was far from over. Downstairs, she sat in the kitchen, staring at the remnants of the celebration. Empty glasses, crumbs from the cake, and scattered decorations surrounded her like ghosts of the evening's false happiness. Every detail reminded her of the betrayal that had been laid bare in front of everyone she knew. Rage simmered inside her chest, mixing with grief and humiliation until it hardened into something darker. The image of the watch, the engraving, and the smug smile of the other woman replayed in her mind like a cruel film she couldn't shut off. Her eyes fell on the knife block by the sink. The steel blades gleamed faintly under the kitchen light. She stood slowly, almost in a trance, and pulled one free. It was heavier than she expected, the weight anchoring her in the moment. She held it tightly, her breathing shallow, her heart pounding like a drum. For the first time that evening, her mask slipped completely. There was no more smiling, no more pretending. Clutching the knife, she walked upstairs, each step deliberate and steady. The anger that had grown quietly all night now surged like a storm, unstoppable and merciless. When she entered the bedroom, Thomas lay unaware, already drifting into sleep. He never opened his eyes again. Morning crept into the neighborhood slowly, with golden sunlight spilling across the roofs and lawns. But at the Williams house, the curtains remained drawn tight, and no movement stirred inside. Neighbors who had heard the noise of last night's celebration expected to see Claire tidying the yard or Thomas heading out for coffee. Instead, the home stood unervingly still, as if frozen in time. By mid-morning, a friend who had attended the party grew uneasy. She remembered Claire's forced smile, the tension that lingered after the uninvited guest left, and the way Thomas had avoided everyone's eyes. Something about the night had felt unfinished, unsettled. When repeated phone calls went unanswered, she decided to check in. Approaching the door, she knocked several times, her unease growing when no sound came from within. Finally, she called the police, worried that something was wrong. When officers arrived, they forced entry after receiving no response. The scene inside told a story no one wanted to believe. Decorations from the party still hung limply. Food sat untouched on the table, and the smell of dried frosting and spilled wine clung to the air. But it was upstairs that the nightmare revealed itself. Thomas lay motionless on the bed, his body soaked in blood, the sheets stained dark. The violence of the attack was unmistakable, leaving no question about his fate. Downstairs, Claire sat quietly in the living room, her posture rigid, her eyes vacant. She didn't run, didn't scream, didn't even attempt to explain. On the coffee table before her rested the knife, placed neatly as though she wanted it to be found. To the officers, it appeared less like a weapon hastily discarded and more like a confession made in silence. The birthday that had begun in celebration had ended in horror. The story of Thomas Williams's death spread quickly through the quiet suburban community, shocking those who had always admired the couple. Neighbors who once envied their seemingly perfect marriage now gathered at the end of the street, whispering about betrayal, rage, and the tragic end of a man who had appeared to have everything. The news reported every detail, from the uninvited guest who disrupted the birthday party to the chilling discovery made by police the following morning. What had looked like a loving household was revealed to be built on secrets. During the trial, the courtroom was packed. Journalists filled the benches, eager to capture each twist of the story. Prosecutors painted Claire as a woman who had carefully masked her rage throughout the night, only to strike when the opportunity arose. They emphasized the engraving on the watch, the humiliation in front of friends, and the brutal violence that followed. Their argument was clear. This was not a crime of impulse, but of deliberate revenge. The defense, however, told a different story. They described a wife pushed past her breaking point, publicly shamed and emotionally shattered. They argued that Claire acted in the heat of passion, consumed by a storm of emotions she could no longer control. They asked the jury to see her not as a cold-blooded killer, but as a betrayed woman who snapped under unbearable pressure. The mistress was called to testify, confirming the affair and admitting that her appearance at the party had been intentional. Her testimony sealed the truth that Thomas had been living a double life, though it did little to ease the weight of his death. In the end, the jury found Claire guilty of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 25 years in prison, a punishment that left the community divided between sympathy and condemnation. What remained was a haunting reminder of how secrets, once exposed, can unravel lives in the most devastating way.